This is News Talk 95.1 FM, 790 AM KFYO, and we've got Scott Braddock, editor of the Quorum Report, on line 2. And Scott, thanks for coming on, and how are things going your direction?
Going well here. We're waiting to see what the governor has to say in his quote-unquote big announcement later today, as he has framed it, about reopening Texas. There's a lot of pressure now to reopen business. You probably saw that President Trump yesterday at the White House laid out some guidelines for the governors and put the onus on the governors to come up with plans for how to restart the economies in their states, amid this COVID-19 pandemic, which the president says, we've sort of turned a corner on that. There are certain states around the country where that seems to be true. It doesn't look like we've peaked here as far as the number of cases in Texas. And the three phases that the governor laid out, or that the president laid out, I think maybe aren't too specific, and they're just guidelines, right? I mean, it's not that the states have to do it this way,
right.
But the president said that they would have a first phase in which movie theaters, restaurants, sports venues, churches, gyms, and other venues could open up, but they'd still have to have strict social distancing guidelines in place. Then there would be a second phase where non-essential travel could resume, bars could open with some restrictions, and in a third phase, there would be no restrictions on workplaces and vulnerable people, the folks who are in the at-risk populations, elderly, and those with other underlying conditions, could also resume, going out to different places, but they'd still have to follow some kind of social distancing. And there was this big back and forth, right, between the president and the press and some of the governors, in which the president had insisted that he had the power to go ahead and do whatever was going to happen here. And these are orders that people are living under based on either their local leadership or their governors, right? I mean, you had pretty quick local action in some of the big urban areas in Texas. I know that Lubbock has done its own things. I know that not everybody agrees with everything that's been done there, and not everybody agrees with some of the things done in the bigger cities, like in Dallas, where they were particularly aggressive. In Harris County, where Houston is, they were pretty quick with a shelter-in-place order there, or a stay-at-home order, rather. In Austin and in Travis County, maybe one of the most significant decisions that was made, not just in Texas, but in the country, was early on, with just about a week out, they canceled South by Southwest, which is a huge international event. People from all over the world come to that.
Massive amounts of money lost overnight.
Massive amounts of money lost, hundreds of millions of dollars lost for the Austin economy. In hindsight, though, a lot of folks are saying it's a pretty good decision, because if you'd have had that international crowd here, Austin could have turned into the same kind of hot spot that New Orleans or New York turned into.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, Scott, and I may have missed it, but what's the timetable on all these changes?
It doesn't seem to be any sort of strict timetable in place. There are some governors that are talking about starting some of this coming up in the next few weeks on May 1st. We may see something similar like that from Governor Abbott. I can tell you that his office has been really on, excuse the pun, but really on lockdown as far as what the details of this plan, quote-unquote plan, is going to be. It's my understanding that not even everybody that works for him in his own office really knows the details at this point, and they were sort of cagey with Texas lawmakers. It's not as if you and I are the only ones who don't know anything about how this is going to go down, with any specifics. Lawmakers being sort of kept in the dark as well. And one example of that, the prime example, was that yesterday we learned that lawmakers were supposed to submit questions to the governor's office by 9 a.m. this morning about the announcement, so that those questions can be answered on a 2 o'clock call, a private conference call with members of the legislature this afternoon at 2. But in the meantime, at noon, that's when the announcement's actually going to be made. Some lawmakers had asked, well, how are we supposed to know what to even ask if you haven't made the announcement for 3 more hours after that? And apparently the answer they got back on that was just to say, well, you can ask anything that you would like, but that still doesn't answer the question, really, because obviously you'd like to know what the proposal is before you ask questions.
So I'm going to be kind of, I guess, a little mean here, you could say, but my big question is, when I heard how, I guess, closed-fisted he's been with getting information out of about this. And just some of the talks that he's had, the speeches or whatever he's had leading up to this, he's been very vague on a lot of things.
Yep.
Do you think that Governor Greg Abbott just didn't want to come up with a plan until he heard what Trump had to say, and maybe even doesn't even have it all together yet?
It would not be out of character for the governor to, as some critics like to say, lead from behind. He often, for example, here in Texas, will rely on the lieutenant governor for his agenda. That's the nicer way to say it, I guess, rather than leading from behind. You may remember in some of the past legislative sessions, some of the most contentious issues, it was the lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, who led the way on the narrative about those things, whether it was property taxes and the property tax caps that they eventually passed in the last legislative session. That was something that Patrick had been driving at for a long time. The bathroom bill in 2017, something that the governor never really got out front on that. The lieutenant governor took the lead. And in this situation, the lieutenant governor really got out there with some comments that upset some people about, maybe older folks maybe being willing to sacrifice their lives for the sake of the economy. I think people know what he was trying to say, or a lot of folks do, but it didn't go over very well, and so he kind of moved back to the background. You haven't heard a whole lot of the lieutenant governor, making big brash comments about this in the meantime. But now it's time for, as somebody else said earlier this morning, it's time for the governor to step up and lead. This is a situation where the governors are in charge, despite that back and forth that the president had with the press and others about who's in charge here. We have a system of federalism, and that means that the states are empowered to handle this the way that they would like. And the governor, I think, is going to maybe move a little cautiously here, because that's been his style of quote unquote leading in the past.
So one thing that you had sent me is a judge in Austin ruled that the Texans should be able to vote by mail if they fear getting sick with COVID-19. That seems a little extreme, just to me. What exactly made him make that decision? What was he looking at?
There was a hearing earlier this week, and interesting that the courts are now meeting, via Zoom online on the online chatting platform, sort of a go-to meeting kind of thing. And why are they meeting that way? Because the lawyers and the judges and everybody's afraid of getting COVID-19. And the question in this hearing earlier this week was whether voters should have to go to polling places around Texas if they fear, contracting this disease. Now, the Texas Democratic Party is suing over this, and this breaks down along partisan lines. Democrats say that expanding vote by mail is something that should happen anyway. They have been arguing that previous to this deal with COVID-19. Republicans say that vote by mail is something that's just ripe for voter fraud, and we have seen examples of voter fraud with vote by mail. But the argument as far as whether or not people can vote that way or go vote in person, I think it has a different weight now because of this, because of the fears of this disease. I think that whatever Governor Abbott has to say in his announcement, by the way, might speak to some of this, because we do have runoff elections that need to be settled before we go on to the general elections in November. The state's attorneys, and the state is a defendant in this case, the state's attorneys argue that, look, you are always at a higher risk of something happening to you when you leave your house. And so to require people to still go and vote in person isn't too onerous, that they could still potentially have some social distancing rules in place at voting locations. The Democrats say that they don't want to take away anybody's ability to go vote in person if that's what they want to do, but they want to offer people the opportunity to qualify for a mail-in ballot if they think that going to the polling place might result in them contracting this disease, which I don't know that we could say that that's a completely, invalid fear.
So one of the things that, as far as this is concerned, is this is going to be a state issue, right? It's going to, who's going to make the final decision if it goes to the courts is the state Supreme Court. This isn't going to be a national thing, right?
You might think that. I'm trying to figure it out. There are two lawsuits right now. One of them is in the state courts, and that's where the judge said that he would move forward with allowing Texans to vote by mail, and of course that'll be appealed by the state. But there's also a similar, almost the exact same lawsuit filed in federal court, and we'll see how that goes, because the Democrats are going to argue in federal court that it's a voting rights issue, which could be an issue for the federal courts. But at the end of the day, the way that these elections are done, they're conducted by the states. It's,
right.
Even in a presidential
There's
election,
a lot of leeway in the Constitution for the states to set up their own voting, the way the vote works, right?
That's right, because as you know and your listeners know, it's not truly a federal election, even though it's for federal office holders. The election is run by the 50 states.
Right. All right. Well, Scott, what's going on at the quorumreport.com?
We're going to try to, solve the mystery here, Matt and David. What exactly is Governor Abbott going to say in his?
You think you're going to be able to solve it even after he says it?
That's the big question, right? It was kind of difficult after he made his quote unquote shelter-in-place order, right? He had to clear it up in a video the next day. So we'll have the coverage and analysis for you at quorumreport.com.
All right, Scott, thanks for being on. It's Scott Braddock, the editor of the Quorum Report, and I guess we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Matt. Talk soon.
Have a good day.